don't mind, I'm going to take my mask off because, and I don't think you'd appreciate sitting through, 45 minutes of that. So, I wanted to start off first with an explanation, and it's not so much an apology, but it's an explanation. This subject, oh geez, here we go. This subject for me, the subject matter for me is very, very emotional, because most of the people that you'll see in the presentation are no longer with us. They're my family, my grandparents, my aunts and uncles, friends of the family, and it's their story. So for me, this is a tremendous responsibility to tell that in a respectful manner, and because of what's going on in our world now, what's happened in our country over the past 4 years plus, it's all the more important that we realize how hate, racism, intolerance, how those things can go from thoughts to words to actions, and those actions carry lasting consequences. So as we go through this, I'm just going to tell you, there are going to be times when I'm not going to be able to talk. I'm going to let the images speak for themselves, and then once I'm able to compose myself, we'll move on. But I'm sure most of us that have gray hair or no hair either have lost a grandparent, or all of our grandparents have lost a parent, if not both, and have friends and family that meant a lot to us. So, the faces that you see, a lot of them are black and white, and because they're black and white, they're abstract. But I want you to project and remember that these abstract images of people that you may or may not know, they were real. They walked with us. They made an impact on the communities in which they lived, and their legacy is part of why I joined the JACL Speakers Bureau, to help tell their story. It's not an easy one to tell, but somebody's got to do it, and that famous quote, if not now, then when, if not me, then who? So, with that, this project, the oral history project that was started by the JACL, the GIRI project. GIRI is a Japanese word, and my Japanese is horrible, but it basically means stick-to-itiveness, fortitude, push through no matter what the odds. So that's the theme behind the oral history project. So I've taken some of our slides from the GIRI project, and there is also a book that's in the archives at Sonoma State that you can check out if you'd like. So without further ado, my family story. So they immigrated from Japan, and like a lot of Japanese immigrants, they came from southern Japan, Hiroshima, Kagoshima area. They were farmers, whether it was crops or some of my family were involved in aquaculture. They did oyster farming in Hiroshima Bay. 3 sides of the family came to the Hawaiian Islands first, Oahu, Kauai, and the Big Island. And then one of my great-grandparents, they came directly to California. And so 3 of my grandparents were born in the Hawaiian Islands, and my dad's mom was born here in Santa Rosa. So being born in the United States, whether it was a trust territory or a state, they were all American citizens, which is a very important thing to keep in the back of your mind throughout the entire presentation. They were American citizens. Their parents, however, were not. And the only reason they weren't is they were not allowed to. There was an exclusion act, so Chinese and Japanese were not allowed to become American citizens. So without citizenship, you then lost the ability to buy land and to vote So there's a whole host of negative impacts of that legislation, which took years and years to overcome, which in large part is why the Japanese American Citizens League was formed in 1929. So when they arrived on the shores of not so much Hawaii, but in California on the mainland, this is what they saw. I'm not sure if you could read the headlines. One of the top ones says, Jap picture brides are Japanizing California. No Japs in our schools. Asiatics must not be naturalized. Japs bring frightful diseases. And then there's a picture of Uncle Sam kicking a Chinese laborer. So it was really hard for people in the mainland to differentiate between Chinese, Japanese, anybody from Asia. They just lumped everybody together. My family, when they came to the Hawaiian Islands, they worked in sugar cane, in the cane fields, and when they came to the mainland, they stayed in agriculture. There weren't a heck of a lot of job opportunities around. The English language skills for my great-grandparents weren't very good. They did ultimately, the Shimizu side and the Otani side did get into the poultry industry, and the Furuta side did farm work. And this picture, the large picture, is, if you can see, there's Caucasian people and some Japanese people. This was right after the Depression, or this is during the Depression, and the Dust Bowl. So these are Okies, and working alongside Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans and Filipinos in the fields. This is my grandmother and grandfather's wedding. They're the two in the middle. So I'm just trying to show you this. This was their life. You know, they came to, their parents came to this country not speaking any English, and they put a lot of responsibility on the shoulders of their children because they went to American schools. My grandfather went to Petaluma High. My grandma went to Anley. Okay. My aunts, my great aunts and great uncles, they went to Anley. They went to Petaluma High. My mom and dad. My dad went to Penn Grove Elementary School, my mom went to Katati School, and they both went to Petaluma High. This is my mom's elementary school picture. She's in the middle with that kind of striped jacket on, and this was taken in 1935, and I'm pretty sure, well, she went to Katati School, so. And this was their life. That's my grandpa Otani working in his garden, and my grandpa Shimizu with his brother-in-law, and I don't exactly know who the other gentleman was. And the kid with the snappy hat, that's my dad. In 1933, the Chicago World's Fair happened in Chicago, and the Manchurian Railroad had an exposition there. The exposition featured a large exhibit hall. The Buddhist church in Sebastopol, Emanji Buddhist temple, they wanted to have a temple, so they purchased a portion of the Manchurian Railroad exhibit, had it disassembled and shipped around the Horn, and then it was reassembled here. And then the picture to the right of that is the dedication in 1934. The Fountain Grove Round Barn, which is no longer there, my great-grandpa Furuta worked up there for Nagasawa, and if you can see the picture to the right of that, my grandpa Otani, my mom and her brothers, Henry and Bill. If you can see the barn in the background, it says Walter Rohnert. He ran a migrant farm worker camp at the Rohnert Seed Farm. The pictures below is a picture of some JCL members carrying a huge American flag down Bodega Avenue in Sebastopol. And then there was some dancing, Japanese dancing, that accompanied the festival. So they were integrated in the community. They were well respected, worked hard, kept their noses clean. So my grandpa and his buddy Yoshi Azuma, and my grandpa and my mom and her kid brother Bill. And then it happened, you know. Things are going along fine, and then it hits the fan. And when it hit the fan, it hit it huge. Press Democrat, photo on top. The enemy's here. Ouster all Japs in California. And then the propaganda started, right? And most of us are familiar with these photos, or if you've never seen them, this is just scratching the tip. it's the little tip of the iceberg of the propaganda machine. I mean, Hollywood got involved and made movies about the insidious Japanese threat. And then in February of 1942, President Roosevelt signed the Executive Order 966. The stories are that when he was struggling with whether to sign it or not, Eleanor Roosevelt said no, but the political and military forces were too strong. EO 9066 led to the evacuation from the West Coast. This is a picture of some members of the Emmanji Buddhist Temple, the minister in front. My grandpa Shimizu is in the back row on the far left, and he was in his mid-20s. These were some of the enemy aliens that the U.S. government was fomenting fear among the populace, farmers, shopkeepers, grandpas, husbands. Then the internment started. The War Relocation Authority was established and hastily set about with the military trying to figure out how to get 120,000 people off the West Coast, and where are you going to put them? How are you going to take care of them? Initially, the folks were taken to railheads in cities near where they lived. The picture on the right is Santa Rosa train station, Railroad Square, just right over there. And these are some images of folks having their belongings packed up and loading the trains. They were taken from home and then sent to assembly centers, the Blue Dots in California. Most of the assembly centers were at fairgrounds, hastily put together, and then ultimately those red squares are the camps, euphemistically called relocation centers. But make no mistake, they were prisons, they were concentration camps, but they were not death camps like the Nazis had. It's a very important distinction. People refer to them, oh, well, they're not as bad as what the Nazis did. Well, there were still prisons. There were still guards, there was barbed wire, there were machine guns, and the guards were given instructions, if someone tries to escape, you shoot to kill. So, our families were told they're being put into the concentration camps for their own safety. The American people were told the Japanese Americans were being put into concentration camps for military necessity. So somewhere in between there lies the truth, or the truth is totally different than that. So this gives you a little bit of an image of where they started at the Merced Assembly Center or Merced Fairgrounds, and then they took a train to Granada, Colorado, which is in southeastern Colorado. High desert, out in the middle of nowhere, very desolate. So after as they loaded up in Merced, back onto the trains, driving through populated areas, the blackout curtains had to come down. And my grandfather tells a story when they were going through the desert, the train stopped, and they said, everybody get out and stretch your legs. And by 1942, the rumors of the Nazi death camps were circulating everywhere. And he said people were thinking to themselves, okay, everybody get off the train and go stretch your legs. And you're out in the middle of nowhere. So they said, is this where it ends? So Merced Assembly Center, you can tell that those are stables in the background, and that's a racetrack. My parents and grandparents were kind of lucky. They didn't have to stay in a stable. I'm not sure how many of you have been around horses, but you can muck out a stall, you can wash it down, you can paint it, but you can't get rid of the smell, okay? And thousands of families were put in these makeshift barracks. They were put in stalls. So I want you to remember, grandmas, grandpas, babies, little kids, your families, that's where they were put. And that's kind of what they look like. I mean, they're not like the Kentucky Derby stables that you see where everything is paved and it's beautiful and clean. These were fairground stables back in 1942. So after their long train trip to Amachi in Granada, Colorado, Hamachi held a population of between 7,000 and 10,000 people throughout the war. Primary residents there, or internees, or prisoners, if you would, were from the Los Angeles area and Northern California. So most of the Japanese Americans from Sonoma County went to Hamachi. And when we were kids, we just heard about our parents and grandparents going to camp. And we had no idea that it was a prison. We just knew they went to camp. And they had yearbooks from middle school and high school. And they showed pictures of them playing baseball and Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts and dances. But when you're, 8 years old, 7 years old, you look at these pictures, you don't really notice that every face is Japanese American. You don't notice at the back of the yearbook, there's a picture of a guard tower with soldiers in it. And some of the graphics of the yearbook show images of barbed wire. So they just went to camp. And it wasn't until the civil rights movement in the 60s and that young Japanese Americans started to say, what happened. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But just every time I hear, oh, Camp Hamachi, I think it's like, oh, Camp Runamuck, they're going to go and play. But yeah, no, this was a different kind of camp. That's one of the guard towers at Hamachi. These are folks coming off the trains going into camp. And there were soldiers. They did have guns. The camps weren't always complete when the internees showed up. The lower right-hand picture is a photo from, I think it's the Denver Post, and they had an article about Japanese Americans coming into camp. The rooms, these barracks for a family, you had an apartment. I hate to call it an apartment. You had a room in a long row house, and you had a potbelly stove, you had some bunks, and you had, I'm not sure if it was one light or two, but there were no interior walls. It was just a room, and that's where your family stayed. Men and women, boys and girls, grandmas and grandpas. It was, anyway, high desert. It was hot and dusty in the summer. Dust came through the cracks because it was just wood and tar paper, no insulation. And then in the wintertime it snowed, and it was really cold. And that dapper young man there is my dad. These are one of the few photos from camp, because when the executive order was issued, the military and the FBI went around collecting contraband items, guns naturally, shortwave radios, and cameras. So there aren't a lot of private photos of this period of time. Toward the end of the war, when it was obvious that the internees were at some point going to be released, cameras made their way into camp. Some photographers made their own cameras from things that were sent to them by friends. So we do have some images. Your family that, in our family, you ate meals together. But when you were in camp, you had to wait in long lines. And a lot of families saw the breakdown of the family unit. The teenagers, teenagers now anyway. It's like, if they had any excuse to not be with their parents, they're going to take it. I want to go hang with my friends. So it was a really terrible time, because there weren't a lot of jobs for folks in camp. So what do you do for 3 years? And then how do you keep your family unit together? So those are just some of the images. The lower color photo is a reenactment of what the barracks looked like. And then you can see that picture of the Granada Pioneer. That's a paper that they set up in camp. Since they didn't have cameras, there were a number of artists, and these are some illustrations of what it was like living in a one-room barrack. And when you didn't have to go do your laundry or take a bath, you were doing it with a lot of other people. I mean, they told me stories when they first got to camp, and I'm not sure if it was at the Assembly Center or if it was at Hamachi, but the bathrooms were a trough with a plank with holes cut in it and no partitions. So if you could think of your grandma having to suffer that kind of indignity. And Japanese people by nature are very private. So to have to endure that was very difficult. And these were some of the photos that we saw in our family's yearbooks. It's like, oh, look, they're playing baseball, oh, they're doing this, they're doing that. Oh, and he went to school. This is my dad's middle school class. He's in the third row in the middle. But, you know, there again, we didn't know that the church services they had, the Boy Scout and Girl Scout meetings, the dances, all of that stuff to try to create a sense of normalcy was all in prison. In 1943, the U.S. allowed Americans of Japanese ancestry to join the military. There were already Japanese Americans in the U.S. military when the war broke out. One of my uncles was in the Army stationed here in California, and the Army didn't know what to do with them. And some of them, they just discharged. The ones in Hawaii, they kind of languished for a while. They said, we want to do something. So they finally formed the 100th Battalion, and they let them come to the mainland and train, and then they sent them to Europe. And you can see the lays. Sorry. You can see the lays around their necks. They distinguished themselves to such an extent in the European the battles that they were in, that the military allowed the formation of a segregated unit. So I think about 18,000 Japanese Americans volunteered from the camps. To form the 442, and they were also allowed to join the military intelligence service. That picture on the upper right is General Merrill. He was a Marine Corps general, and he had Japanese American translators, interpreters with him in the South Pacific. And he was famous for his group of Marines. They called them Merrill's Marauders. And there's been movies made about him and their exploits. And he credited with the Japanese American translators that were with him on shortening the war. He said, in his estimation, they shortened the war by at least a year. Saved hundreds of thousands, if not, millions of lives. And you can see the 442 capturing Germans and captured a Nazi flag. So they really distinguished themselves. And one of their famous battles, they had just come off 4 or 5 days of heavy fighting. And the general that was in charge of the, I'm not sure if it was a division or whatever, but the 442 was a part of it. And this general had another unit, the 141st Infantry Regiment that was made up of volunteers from Texas. And he sent them, they were in France at the time, and he sent them ahead to establish a foothold behind enemy lines. And he told them to take this hill and hold it. So they did, but they immediately got surrounded, and they were cut off from supplies, and they were cut off from the rest of the troops. And there were a couple of unsuccessful rescue attempts by other units to try to get to them. And this general, after the 442 came off of, several days of heavy fighting, they were coming back to the rear and hopefully to get some rest and some hot meals. And he said, no, you have to go rescue the lost battalion. So they fought for 10 days. there were 270 members of the Lost Battalion. They rescued 211. They lost 30 of their soldiers, and more than 800 were injured. This pit battle map at the lower left, you can kind of see a round blue dot at the bottom. That's the top of a hill, a mountain, and that's where the Lost Battalion was. And you can see the picture next to it. You can see how steep the terrain was. And the German soldiers, they had machine gun nests and set up around the mountain. And they were just wiping people out as they tried to come up. So one of the things that the 442 is known for, their battle slogan was "Go for broke." It's a pidgin, Hawaiian pidgin English gambling term. When you're shooting dice, it's like, go for broke. Bet it all. So there were 2 or 3 individuals who ultimately were awarded Congressional Medals of Honor because they were pinned down, and they said the only way for us to get up there is if we just charge. If we try to go from tree to tree, inch by inch, we're just going to get picked off. Our only hope is to rush the Germans headlong, rush them headlong, and see if we can crack, break through. And it was individuals that there was one gentleman, I don't remember his name, but he took his Browning automatic rifle, charged up the hill, and wiped out 2 Nazi machine gun nests by himself, and enabled the troops behind him to follow along, and they were able to finally break through. So after they rescued the the Lost Battalion, they came back and they thought, okay, now we're going to get some rest. But their general had other things in mind, and they sent them into battle again. So they were almost in continuous fighting for a month in eastern France, near the German border. And the general, after this campaign, they had these victories, and he wanted to be able to honor them. So he ordered their commander to have these companies report to get unit citations, etc. And when they showed up, there weren't a lot of soldiers. And he said, you just disobeyed a direct order. I told you to have all of your soldiers report. And he said, this is all that's left. They lost half their men. They were either killed or injured. As an example, there was one company, K Company, they had 186 men. At the end, they had 17. I Company started out with 185 men. At the end, they had 8. So they were in fierce battles. And the general that was in charge, he didn't admit it, but military experts later said he used them as cannon fodder. He just threw them into battle where the odds were stacked against them. The 522nd, one of my dad's cousins, John Kawada, was in that. And they were one of the first units to help liberate, and I don't know if my pronunciation is correct, Kaufering and Landsberg. These were subcamps in Dachau. So the American soldiers you see in these photos, they're Japanese Americans. The top photo, you can see them, looking at the carnage, the dead bodies. And at my dad's cousin's funeral, one of his buddies from the 442 came and was talking about him. And we never knew what he did in the war. And he never talked about it because They were told, this is top secret, you can't talk about it. And so they didn't. And then after time, it was so horrific that it's like, how do you talk about it? His buddy said that when they were walking through the camp, they saw the dead bodies first and the stench. And there were no German soldiers around, they had already left. And then he said these ghosts walked up to us. And they were all the Jewish and Gypsy prisoners. And, you know, he said it was horrific. So yeah, until my dad's cousin's funeral, his kids didn't know. We always knew that he had been in the war and that he had a drinking problem and he had demons, but we didn't know the extent of it until his funeral. So it was really sobering. The 442, that statement on the right, just read it. I have a hard time reading it every time it comes up. They were formed in 1943. They were disbanded in 1945. So in a little more than 2 years, for their size and their length of service. It's something to say you're the most decorated unit, and a decoration in the military is a medal. Most of those were Purple Hearts, which means you were injured in combat. Of the 18,000 members, they got over 4,000 Purple Hearts, 21 congressional medals of honor. Many of those weren't issued until decades later, I think like 2000. If I'm not mistaken, I think immediately after the war, by the end of the war, there was only one Japanese American that had received a Medal of Honor, even though they had been nominated and recommended by their commanding officers for their gallantry and heroism. Most Medals of Honor are awarded to people that give their lives or put their lives at grave risk to save their buddies. And they received 7 presidential unit citations. And here's a picture of Harry Truman awarding some of those unit citations to the 442. The Japanese American community here in Sonoma County, they know these names well because we've heard about them as kids. We've heard about them ever since we were little. If you've ever been to the Buddhist temple in Sebastopol, the memorial hall there is dedicated to their memory. And I think one of the things that struck me is Joe Yasuda, and I knew his nephew, who was named after him. And Joe was only 17 when he died. And the others were Peter and Leo Kikuchi. They were in their early 20s. And there were many, many other Japanese Americans from Sonoma County that served. My uncle Min Furuta was injured in Italy shortly after they landed. And there were many, many others. A number of them I met through my dad being involved in the JACO, and Ed Kaoka, Ed Oki, a number of these guys. And after the war was over, they set about rebuilding our community, rebuilding their lives. This is a picture of the Takata family, who are cousins, and they sent this photo to my grandparents, and this is their barrack at Amachi as they were on the way home. This is the train station at Granada. So over time, and it didn't all happen on one day, over the course of weeks, if not months, internees were released from camp. My grandpa Shimizu decided he didn't want to go back to California because he had heard the stories of the racism and hatred and the things that were going on. So he said, let's go east. So for good or ill, he went to Erie, Pennsylvania and started a potato ranch. And he was going to try to set up a Japanese community in Erie, Pennsylvania. And as when I was old enough to understand what was what and where Erie, Pennsylvania was, I said, Grandpa, I'm really glad that great-grandma got sick and you had to come back to California, because it gets really cold in Erie, Pennsylvania, and I really didn't think that being a potato farmer would be such a great thing. On their way back from Erie to California, they swung south and went through Texas, and they pulled up to a gas station, and there were my grandma, grandpa, and the kids, and my grandmother went into the little store at the gas station to get something for the kids to eat. And this lady came out and she said, excuse me, y'all Japanese? And she didn't know how to respond. She said, yes. And she said something to the effect of, honey, but your boys did for the boys in Texas. We owe you a debt of gratitude. Can't. So she brought out, a bunch of sandwiches and drinks for the family. Because the members of the 141st, they said, 442, you guys are honorary Texans. And when my grandmother told that story, she just said that she was just so shocked and surprised. And she said it helped to rekindle her faith in human kindness. So this picture was taken in 1950. My great-grandma is sitting in the middle, and my grandma and grandpa, and their kids. My dad and my Uncle Marlon are in the back. My Uncle Marlon's in the light-colored Army uniform, and my dad's in an Air Force uniform. So when the Korean War broke out, my dad and one of his buddies said, you know what, they're going to draft us. We better enlist. So they enlisted in the Air Force. And then my uncle's a year younger, so he waited a little too long, and so he was drafted into the Army. And then when my dad left, he and my mom had been boyfriend-girlfriend for a while. That's the photo she sent with him. My dad was lucky. I mean, he was smart. He said, I don't want to sleep in a muddy hole. I'm going to join the Air Force. So even though he got stationed overseas, he was stationed in Japan. So he didn't see combat. But my other uncles did. My Uncle Kyo Marlon, his kid brother, was in Korea, and he had the horrible duty of going into the battlefields and reclaiming fallen soldiers. So he said one day they were on a armored personnel carrier or a half-track or something, going to a battle scene, and off in the distance he heard this, and he grew up around firearms, and he said immediately someone yelled sniper, and he hit the deck, and he looked over and his first lieutenant was dead. So he had demons after the war. My Uncle Bill, who's with my grandma and my Auntie May on the left, and my Uncle Henry on the right, they were both stationed in Korea. And my Uncle Bill, they were the only two boys in the Otani family. My Uncle Bill was a machine gunner, so he was on the front lines, and he would tell stories of the firefights at night, tracer rounds, whistles, screaming. He said he was never more scared in his whole life. My Uncle Bill had an alcohol problem too. My Uncle Henry, because they were the only two boys, got permission from his commanding officer to go find my Uncle Bill and bring him back to bring him away from the front line. So by himself, he went across Korea to find his kid brother. My Uncle Henry had alcohol problems too. So Yeah, PTSD. They didn't know what it was called then. They came home, started rebuilding their lives. My mom and dad got married. These are family gatherings at the Owatani family. And I'm sure if you guys look through your photo albums, you're going to have pictures just like this. Faces are different, but the settings are the same. Get a family together. This is a picture of the JCL chapter in the early 1960s, or sometime in the 1960s. My dad's on the second from the left, and then next to him is Ed Oki and Jim Murakami. There's all these faces of people I grew up with and had impacts on my life, and most of them are gone now. Jim Murakami was the JCL national president at one point in time. He was inspirational in getting me involved in JCL. Ed Oki was a veteran of 442, and we, as kids, we'd always ask him to pull up his sleeve and show us his scar from where he was wounded. And he's the one that got me to start donating blood too. I forget how many gallons of blood he gave. So over time, the family grew. Kind of tried to put camp in the back of our minds. These are my mom and dad, my brothers and sisters. Life goes on. That's my grandpa Otani with the hat on. He's pouring sake at the Obon Festival, and my grandma Otani dancing. That was their favorite thing because that's where they met in Hawaii. They met at Obon Festival. My brother and I, my grandpa and my kid brother Arnold, my mom and dad. So my grandfather's, I just forgot. I think it was their 80th birthday party, 80th or 88th birthday party. Because of my uncles and my dad's service, I joined the military too. I was in the Coast Guard, I was a medic. It's just one of those things. They told me all the interesting stories. They didn't tell me all the gory ones until I came back. So thanks a lot. It was the same thing with, with growing old. They didn't tell me all the bad parts of it. They just, when you get older, people don't tell you what to do. That lower picture, those are all the men in the Shimizu family. Not including my son and my nephews. In the Vietnam War protests, civil rights movement, young Japanese Americans said, our history had some bad stuff go on, and there was never a formal apology. Executive Order 9066 was still on the books. The ability for the government to round up citizens and non-citizens just because of their race still existed. The Supreme Court cases that ruled the internment legal was still on the books. They said, we got to do something about this. The 60s and 70s were vastly different than the 1930s and early 40s. We had, because of the GI Bill, we had college-educated Nisei that had been in the military. Their kids had college educations. We had doctors, lawyers, teachers, and at this point in time, we had politicians. Dan Inoue, Spark Matsunaga from Hawaii, Norman Netta, Bob Matsui from California, Patsy Mink. So we had some power behind us, and so they said, when I was lucky, I was working for the JCL at the time when the redress movement started. And I remember being in a meeting with, it's surreal when I think about this. We were in a meeting with Dan Inoue, Spark Matsunaga, Norman Netta, Bob Matsui, and they're saying, well, yeah, you can go forward with redress, but it's not going to pass. You can't get this to pass Congress unless you can educate all those congressmen and senators, the representatives and senators, until you can educate them. The guys that were in the military kind of knew, but that was maybe half of Congress. And the rest of them, they didn't understand. All they knew is you were looking for a handout. You wanted an apology and you were looking for money. get in line. So they said, our only hope is to do an educational campaign. We have to educate the American people, we have to educate Congress. So that was the strategy. So they had hearings in Congress, and ultimately they established the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. I mentioned the Supreme Court case. Fred Korematsu is there with the pipe, Min Yasui's in the middle, and Gordon Hirabayashi is on the right. They challenged this. They said, we're not going to go to camp. We'll fight this to the Supreme Court. Min Yasui was one of the few attorneys in the Japanese American community. And he knew the Constitution. He said, we have a case. Fred Korematsu didn't want to go because he said, this isn't right, I don't want to go. He wasn't an attorney, but he said, no, I'm going to stand on conviction, I'm not going to go. Gordon Hirabayashi similarly. So they went to the Supreme Court and they lost. In 1976, President Ford issued this proclamation and he apologized for the internment and acknowledged that Executive Order 9066 was wrong. So that was the first thing, okay, an apology. There's a picture of Danny Noe talking about that. I'm not sure if you guys know about Danny Noe. He was made famous during the Watergate hearings as, what the hell did one of the senators call him? The little Jap. If you look at his sleeve, you'll see that there's no hand at the end of it. He was a captain in the Army in the 442, and he lost his arm. He tells a poignant story coming back from Europe, or came from Europe to the mainland, and was in a military hospital for quite some time recovering from his wounds. And he was in Oakland and in his uniform with captain with all the medals. And he went into a barbershop to get a haircut because he wanted to look good when he got home. And the guy said, we don't serve Japs here. And he's standing there in his U.S. military uniform, ribbons on his chest, captain's bars, and that sentiment was still there. So he said, some battles are not worth fighting. You can't fight that kind of ignorance. It's only fought with education. At the end, the wartime relocation, or the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, they held hearings around the country, and they took testimony from individuals who were interned, from educators, historians, anyone who knew something about that period of time. And at the end, the findings of the commission's hearings were that the internment was due to racism and greed. The Japanese Americans in the West Coast had valuable farmlands that they had developed in the Central Valley and elsewhere. They controlled the fishing fleet. They innovated fishing on the West Coast, so the Long Beach fishing fleet was run primarily by Japanese Americans. And there were a lot of other businesses that they owned. And there were a lot of, there were a number of organizations that wanted them out. Native Sons of the Golden West being one of them. So military necessity, not so much. Put them in camp for their own protection, not so much. Get them out of the way because there were financial interests at stake. The governor of Hawaii, shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, wrote to the president and said, do not remove Japanese Americans from the Hawaiian Islands. They are integral to the defense of the islands. Okay, so military necessity. One of the other things they fomented was fear of what they called fifth column activity, subversives, spies. They're spying for Japan. The FBI investigated, and at the end of the war, they had no incidents of espionage by any Japanese Americans. So, in 1988, a bill went past Congress to authorize financial compensation for the internees. a whopping $20,000 per person. And we were having one of those conversations at national headquarters. I said, well, how much are we going to ask for? And they said, well, you cannot ask for what people deserve because they would need millions of dollars. You take away their livelihood, you basically remove wealth generation from an entire generation, if not two. So they said, well, what do we ask for? Well, whatever dollar amount it's just going to be symbolic. In the early 1970s, during the Vietnam War protests, a number of protesters were arrested and put in Shea Stadium in New York. Shea Stadium, New York. Anyway, they were held there for a whole weekend without trial, without charges, and they sued. And it went through the courts, and they were awarded $20,000 apiece for being falsely imprisoned for a weekend. So that's where the $20,000 came from. But more important than that symbolic gesture was the establishment of an educational fund. And that fund was used to help create GIDI and other projects like that around the country. So whether it's a JACL chapter or a educational institution or another organization, they can access funds to help create educational materials or put on events to make sure something like this never happens again. Amachi was made a National Historic Site years ago, and there's a Merced Assembly Center has a dedication there. But on February 14th, that picture there is of Interior Secretary Deb Haaland. She's Native American. They passed a bill in Congress to put Amachi under the National Park Service. So it will have funding to help tell the story in the future. And that gentleman with the white hair is familiar to most of the Japanese Americans in our community, Bob Fujigami. He used to teach at Sonoma State. He was a professor in the education department. I think he was head of the education department. The thing I remember about Bob was when I was thinking about going to college, he said, you know, they put us in camp, they took away our freedom, they took away this, they took away that. He said, you get an education, that's one thing they can't take away from you. He said, get an education. The words on the bottom are from Senator Inoue. This chapter in history must remain in our collective conscience as a grave reminder of what we are capable of in a time of crisis and what we must not allow to happen again to any group, regardless of race, religion, or national origin. And I know that he was doing backflips in his grave the previous 4 years during the Trump administration. And, you know, we see that being repeated over and over again. In 1979, remember when the Shah of Iran fell and the U.S. Embassy was taken by protesters and they were held, the embassy workers were held captive for months. The U.S. Congress was debating whether they should round up Iranians, citizens and non-citizens, and put them in camps. 1979, not that long ago. We had camps on our border to detain quote-unquote illegals from coming in that were seeking asylum, separating parents from their children. So education is our only weapon against this kind of intolerance and racism. My family survived and thrived and continues on. That's a picture from the Obon Festival at the Buddhist temple a few years ago. That's my dad with his sisters and his auntie, and my mom and her sister. My mom passed away in 2011, and my Auntie May died shortly in 2018, shortly after the Tubbs fire burned her house down in Coffey Park. She had been in poor health, but she just couldn't overcome that. But, you know, happy times, family keeps growing. My dad's still with us. Daughter's getting married. So I want to thank the Museum of Sonoma County for giving us the opportunity, first, to present Ansel Adams' photos, that important documentation of Manzanar, and to the Sonoma County Japanese American Citizens League for, you know, allowing me to take up part of to be one of the speakers during our programs over the next few months. This exhibit's going to run through May, and we have speakers that will be talking about Manzanar. And there was an incident during the camps where the U.S. government asked Japanese Americans who were interned if they would serve in the U.S. military, or would they forswear allegiance to the Empire of Japan. And you can imagine being in prison and asking people, you know, folks that were born in the United States or had chosen to live in the United States, do you forswear allegiance to the Emperor of Japan? It's like, I never had any allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. How can I forswear allegiance to someone I had never sworn allegiance to? So it was a stupid question, but it caused a tremendous turmoil in our community. And Henry's going to talk about that in a few weeks. So with that, I know I went really long. Oh, I didn't go that long. If anybody has any questions, I'd be more than happy to fumble through and answer.
Was the property in Katati there confiscated from them?
No, because my great-grandfather bought his property in my grandfather's name, and my grandpa was born out of Oahu, so he was an American citizen. My grandpa Otani had property as well, and he bought it in my mom's name. I think he bought it in he bought his own property. He was a citizen because he was born on the Big Island in Hawaii. So they were citizens, but that wasn't the case for many, many other families that couldn't own this. So they were renting. There were a lot of Japanese business owners in, you know, cities and towns across California that they didn't own the buildings. They were just leasing them or renting them. So they lost everything. Was there another question back there somewhere? Yeah, one of the interesting things, John Tateishi, who was the chairman of the redress committee during the beginning of the redress movement, has served in various capacities within the JACL over the years. He told a story that his family was in Southern California, and they had a truck farm, and his truck farm is smack dab in the middle of what's now Westwood, right near UCLA. So, yeah, there's stories like that all over.
There is a panel downstairs that said something about that coming back to Sonoma County was not as difficult as going back to some of the areas in California.
Oh yeah, we were really lucky in Sonoma County because.
Go ahead, answer it. That's it.
Oh, we were really lucky in Sonoma County because for whatever reason, the Japanese Americans here, they worked hard, they kept their noses clean, they participated in community activities as much as they could. And like my dad was telling me, when they came back from Pennsylvania, when the first day of high school was coming up, he was really nervous because he didn't know how he was going to be treated. Because before the war, when they were being evacuated, you know, being called a Jap, having rocks thrown at them, that was not uncommon. So going back to school, he had a lot of apprehension. And he said he, you know, went to school and, you know, you're in PE class and his buddies who he's known since elementary school, you know, they finally come up to him and, hey, welcome back. Let's go play some basketball. And because there was a large Jewish community in the poultry industry here in Sonoma County, and they knew what was happening to their families and friends in Europe, a lot of Japanese ranches were helped by Jewish poultry farmers here and others in the Jewish community to help rent their properties out. And my family was like that. They had people taking care. But, you know, you could take what you can in one suitcase. Everything else you had to leave behind or sell. What they couldn't sell, they put in one of the rooms of the house and put a lock on the door, and what's going to happen is going to happen. They came back and the room was empty, but, you know, they kind of knew. Some families said, screw it, if I can't sell it, I'm going to, and some things they buried, or some things they just burned. You know, it's like, if I can't take it, I'm not going to give it to let somebody else have it. So there's stories like that. They just run the gamut, and it's incomprehensible to me in 2022 what that would be like for me to tell my kids and my grandkids, okay, we've got 48 hours, 72 hours, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks. We have to pack everything up, get rid of what we can, and we're going to go somewhere. We don't know where. We're going to go somewhere, and we don't know for how long, or if we'll ever be able to come back. It just boggles my mind. And remember, they didn't have cell phones. You know, a lot of families didn't even have telephones. If they did, it was a party line, right? So getting information around was not easy.
Seems to me they could draw a straight line from what happened 77 years ago to right now, and you've done that. But when you talk about education as being the key, there are movements out there to actually not educate people. They're burning books. They're restricting access to information that might be offensive to people. And then we see on the streets incidents of Asian violence. It saddens me deeply.
Yeah, anti-intellectualism in our country hit a high, you know, during the Trump administration. And that's one of the reasons why Henry Kaku is the chairman of our Speakers Bureau and has been for a number of years. And it's a small group, but we go to schools and whoever asks to talk about this experience because, you know, it's an unfortunate part of our legacy. And, you know, after the Holocaust, the Jewish community said, you know, let us never forget. You know, we can't let this happen again. And, you know, yet there are people that deny the Holocaust happened. Of course, they deny we landed on the moon, and they think the world is flat. But nonetheless, there are millions and millions of people in our country that feel similarly, that, you know, that white people are under attack and that they have to fight back, and that science is, you know, it is sad, but it just strengthens our resolve to get that message out there. And, you know, even though we're preaching to a choir, I'm hoping, unless somebody's going to attack me in the parking lot.
You never know.
But you never know. And when we go to schools, I was at Santa Rosa Middle School last week, or earlier this week, speaking to a class, and I just asked them, how old are you guys? You know, 12, 13 years old. I said, okay, my dad was your age when they put him in camp. And then we went through a little exercise to kind of visualize. If you had 48 hours, 72 hours a week to pack up one suitcase, you know, not one of these big, huge ones, one suitcase, what would you take? You can't take your pets, you know.
And your suitcase had no wheels.
Yeah.
That's what I said last
And if you're this big, you can't carry it, so, yeah.
To answer one of your earlier questions about the property, in Sonoma County, as a part of the oral history, we've asked as many questions as we can about people who have lived here during the war and after the war. And we haven't found any single family who owned land that lost it after the war. Yet up and down California, like my parents up in Oregon and Washington, over 80% of the Japanese Americans, even if they own land, lost it. So it's really unique here in Sonoma County. But anyway, I'm not here to talk about that.
What are you here to talk about, Henry?
Just the future. If you like what you just heard today with Bruce, we have 3 more programs coming up. It will be on the website here on the county. But on March 19th, we have George, one of my speakers in my committee, talking about the Ansel Adams exhibit. He's a historian. He was one of the original people who helped put together the Ansel Adams exhibit. In April 2nd, we have a poet who's another member of my Speakers Bureau, and she wrote beautiful poems about her mother being incarcerated. And April is a poet month. And so anyway, so she'll be giving a presentation, and then in May, I'll be giving a presentation. I don't even know what day it was. Anyway, it'll be on the website, but I'll be talking, as Bruce said earlier, about the dissidents, those who protested. In addition to the 3 gentlemen that he mentioned, there were about 15,000 individuals who did protest and their lives. So anyway, so these are future programs that we're putting together here with the exhibit. So hopefully tell others, and thank you, Bruce.
Thanks, Henry.
Thank you all for coming.